The metal cuffs snapped shut with a force that made the sound echo off the gas station pumps. My cheek hit the asphalt, warm and gritty under the late afternoon sun, the kind of heat that cooks through your skin. Above me, someone laughed, a sharp, young voice filled with arrogance, as he looked at my ID like it was part of a joke. Yes, that scene played out right there beside pump number 3 at a Sunoco station off Route 47, with a dozen people holding up their phones. And in that frozen moment, somewhere between a camera flash and a boot on my spine, I realized two things. First, I was still Judge Arthur Davis, Federal District Court. Second, none of that mattered to the men who had already decided what kind of man I was. 30 minutes earlier, I had been in chambers, shirt pressed, glasses low on my nose, sifting through a mountain of case files that could have made any honest officer lose sleep. Corruption reports, fabricated stops, evidence that seemed to appear out of thin air. And tomorrow morning, I was scheduled to preside over the city's largest police corruption trial in decades. Call that fate. I call it the universe whispering before it screams. I'd only pulled over for gas, to grab a coffee, maybe make it to a meeting with federal prosecutors before the rush hour. But when I glanced in the mirror and saw the black and white patrol car that had been tailing me for 3 miles slide in behind my BMW, I felt a shift, the kind you feel before a storm hits. 2 officers stepped out, one white, one Hispanic, both young, both wired tight. The white one, Officer Sean Evans, wore a grin you usually see before a shove, not a greeting. His partner, Officer Luis Navarro, scanned my hands, then hovered near his holster like muscle memory had taken over common sense. I stayed calm. Hands open, movements slow. I did exactly what you teach your kids to do, even when it kills a piece of your dignity. "Good afternoon, officers," I said evenly. "I'm Judge Arthur Davis, Federal District Court. If you'd like to verify my ID, it's in my wallet." The air didn't cool, but it got heavier. Sean's face flushed red, not from the sun, but from pride curdling into rage. "Oh, you're a judge, huh?" he mocked. "What's next? You the president, too?" When I reached, slow, careful, for my wallet, I could already feel it coming. Luis's gun cleared his holster before logic cleared his head. The crowd scattered, phones rose, and I thought, here it is. The moment people talk about in past tense. "Hands on the car," Sean barked. "Now," I obeyed. Palms flat, fingers interlaced. The cuffs clamped so tight my fingertips went numb. Tight enough to make a point. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. They snatched my wallet, flipped it open. For a heartbeat, Luis hesitated. I saw the doubt flicker, the glint of my federal ID catching his conscience. "Sean," he murmured. "Look at this." Sean grabbed the badge, held it up like a prop. "Federal judge? Sure, and I'm the damn president." He laughed, loud, performative, for the cell phones watching. "Nice fake, dealer." And that's when the show began. Pocket search, medication bottle, lifted high. "What's this?" "Blood pressure meds," I said calmly. "My name's on the label." "Yeah, sure," he sneered. "Pills, got that?" Then I saw it. Luis's hand slipped to his belt, pulling a small plastic baggie. He pretended to find it in my console, holding it up like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. The gasp that followed wasn't just shock. It was history repeating itself. Across the lot, Omar Khan, the station owner, whispered, "I got that on video." And I thought, good. Remember the angle. Remember the light. Because this isn't just a story. It's evidence. They shoved me into the back of the cruiser, the door closing with a dull, final thud. I sat there, wrists burning, mind cataloging each violation like footnotes in a textbook. Unlawful stop. No probable cause. Ignoring clear identification. Warrantless search. Fabricated evidence. Public humiliation. I wasn't reciting law to stay clever. I was reciting it to stay sane, to keep my thoughts from cracking under the weight of someone else's lie. The car rolled toward the precinct, lights flashing, and all I could hear, louder than the siren, was the sound of a justice system I had sworn to defend, turning its own rules into weapons. The drive to the precinct felt longer than the highway itself. Sirens cut through the air like blades, even though there was no traffic to warn. I stared out through the smudged window, watching streetlights smear into yellow streaks, each one reminding me how quickly justice can blur when power loses patience. Inside the cruiser, Officer Evans hummed, some off-key tune that made my skin crawl. Navarro sat silent beside him, jaw tight, eyes darting toward the rearview mirror every few seconds, as if he could see my badge still glinting in his memory. No one said a word to me until we pulled into the parking lot of the 7th Street precinct. A squat, gray building that looked less like a hall of justice and more like a warehouse for bad decisions. The walls were peeling, the fluorescent lights flickered, and the sign above the entrance read, "Serve and protect." Letters half missing, irony intact. When the car stopped, Evans opened my door and yanked me out with the same enthusiasm a hunter might show for fresh prey. "Watch your step, Your Honor," he mocked. The sarcasm hit harder than the shove that followed. Inside, the air smelled of bleach, coffee, and something sour. Fear, maybe. I'd smelled it before, in holding cells and interrogation rooms during my years as a prosecutor. Back then, I thought it belonged to the guilty. Now I realized it belonged to everyone trapped in the system's blind spot. Behind the front desk sat Sergeant Chris Johnson, a man who looked like he'd seen too many shifts and not enough sunlight. Evans dropped my wallet onto the counter like a trophy. "Caught ourselves a big one," he bragged. "Dealer pretending to be a federal judge." Johnson didn't laugh. He picked up the ID, turned it in the light, ran his thumb along the seal. His brows twitched. "This looks real," he muttered. Evans smirked. "High-quality fake. These guys are getting creative." For a moment, Johnson met my eyes, the way a man looks when his conscience wakes up. Then he swallowed whatever he felt and started typing. "Name?" he asked, even though it was written right in front of him. "Arthur James Davis," I said calmly. "Occupation?" "Federal District Court Judge." His fingers froze for a second before moving again. "You'll get your call later," he said flatly. That sentence, "You'll get your call later," did more damage than the cuffs. Rights aren't supposed to run on someone else's schedule. They led me to a holding cell. Metal bench, concrete walls, a toilet bolted in the corner like a bad joke. The door clanged shut behind me, the echo settling in my chest. Through the bars, I could hear them talking. Evans performing for an audience that didn't exist. Possession with intent, fake ID, resisting. Got the whole list. Navarro mumbled something I couldn't catch, but the tone wasn't pride. It was guilt chewing through silence. Every few minutes I heard laughter, typing, the squeak of shoes on tile, the soundtrack of bureaucracy grinding through another injustice. Then a new sound cut through the noise, the faint vibration of a phone. One ring, another, then 3. I didn't know it yet, but that was my clerk, Emily Chin, calling my office phone, then my cell, then the courthouse. Emily was the kind of person who noticed when a stapler went missing, so when I didn't show for a 6 p.m. meeting, she knew something was wrong. By 6:45, she had contacted the U.S. Marshal Service, cross-checked badge logs, and started a quiet storm that would soon rattle the city. Back in the cell, I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, breathing through the static in my head. I remembered the hundreds of defendants I'd told, "Stay calm. The truth will surface." Now I understood how hollow that sounded from the other side of the bars. Evans came back with a camera for booking photos. "Face forward," he ordered. I did. Turn left. Click. Right. Click. He smiled as the flash went off, pretending it was just another routine. But his hands trembled slightly, a tell I'd learned to spot in witnesses on the stand. He wasn't as sure as his smirk suggested. Fingerprint him, Johnson said. Voice low, Evans pressed my hand down onto the ink pad, rolled each finger like he was stamping ownership. You nervous, Judge? He sneered. No, I replied quietly. Are you? He froze for a beat, then laughed too loud, like someone drowning out their own doubt. Minutes dragged into an hour. Outside, the precinct buzzed with small talk, until a rookie officer rushed in, breathless, holding up his phone. Sir, this video's all over the internet, he said. Gas station footage. People are saying, shut it off, Evans snapped. Fake news, but Johnson had already leaned over to look. The clip showed the arrest, the cuffs, the planted bag. Omar's voice saying, I got that. The room went quiet. Then the phone started ringing. 1, then 3, then a chorus, the mayor's office, a local news station, and, finally, the call that froze the whole room. The FBI liaison office. Captain Miller, the desk sergeant said, voice tight. They're asking about a Judge Davis. Evans' face went pale. Navarro turned toward me, whispering something I couldn't hear. Johnson put the phone on hold and looked straight at Evans. What exactly did you two do? Evans didn't answer. He didn't have to. The station, suddenly, didn't feel as bright. I sat there in silence, knowing the same system that had caged me was now about to crack under the weight of its own evidence. Somewhere out there, strangers with phones had refused to look away, and that was about to make all the difference. The silence before a storm is always the loudest, and that night, the 7th Street precinct had gone eerily quiet. The chatter had died, the laughter evaporated, and every pair of eyes was glued to the ringing phones. I could hear Evans pacing just beyond the cell door, muttering into his radio, trying to sound in control. But his voice trembled. That edge of panic a man gets when he realizes the floor beneath him isn't solid anymore. Johnson had retreated to his office. The blinds were half drawn, but I could see him arguing with someone on the phone. Navarro sat on a bench, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The truth was finally doing what no courtroom ever could, working its way through fear and ego, one uneasy breath at a time. Then, just after midnight, headlights washed across the windows. Not one pair, but a dozen. Engines idled, doors slammed, and the air filled with clipped professional voices. The front doors burst open. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody move. The sound of boots hitting tile echoed through the building. Steady, controlled, inevitable. Evans froze, mid-sentence. Navarro stood. Johnson came out of his office, phone still in hand. Color drained from his face. A tall woman in a navy jacket stepped forward, her badge gleaming even under the flickering lights. Her voice was sharp, calm, and final. I'm Special Agent Maria Keller, FBI Internal Affairs Division. We're here under federal warrant for obstruction of justice, unlawful detainment, and falsified evidence. The words hit like a verdict. Evans tried to speak. Something about a misunderstanding. But Keller cut him off. Save it for your lawyer. Behind her, agents spread out, collecting body cams, seizing computers, bagging paperwork. Every drawer opened sounded like another piece of the old order collapsing. One agent walked to the cell block, keyring in hand. When he stopped in front of my door, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, recognition flickering in his eyes. Judge Davis? Yes, he nodded once. We're sorry this happened, sir. The metal door slid open. For the first time in hours, I could stretch my wrists without the bite of steel. Freedom doesn't always come with cheers. Sometimes it comes with silence so thick it feels sacred. Keller approached me personally. "Sir, you've been formally cleared. We're transporting you to the field office for a statement. You'll have full protection until this is over." Evans tried to follow, blurting, "He had drugs!" Keller turned, eyes cold. "We already reviewed the footage. The only thing he had was a tank full of gas and a badge that outranks yours." The precinct felt smaller with every passing second. The air, heavy with the realization that careers were ending in real time. As the agents led me out, I glanced back at Navarro. He met my eyes briefly, guilt etched deep in his face. Then he did something I didn't expect. He whispered, "I'll talk. I'll tell them everything." For the first time, I believed him. Outside, the night was cool, quiet. The chaos of red and blue lights painting the wet asphalt like a storm of truth. Reporters were already gathering near the barricades, cameras flashing. I stepped into the armored SUV, the door shutting behind me with a heavy thud that felt more like closure than confinement. Keller sat across from me, tablet in hand. "Judge, we've reviewed dash-cam footage, surveillance from the gas station, and multiple civilian recordings. It's bad. They planted evidence, filed false charges, and one of them tried to submit a fake arrest report to the county database." I nodded slowly. "You'll handle it?" Her lips pressed into a firm line. "We already are." For a few miles we drove in silence. The city passed by like a reflection I no longer recognized. Finally, Keller asked quietly, "What were you thinking in there?" "When they cuffed you?" I stared out the window, the streets blurring past. "I was thinking," I said slowly, "that I've spent my life defending a system that doesn't always defend back. But tonight, maybe that changes." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. When we reached the field office, I was led into a quiet room. No bars, no concrete walls, just a desk, a recorder, and a warm cup of coffee that tasted like dignity restored as I gave my statement. Agents moved through the halls collecting data, cross-referencing body cam timestamps, piecing together what would become one of the most publicized police corruption cases in the state. By dawn, arrest warrants had been filed. Evans and Johnson were in custody. Navarro was cooperating. And I, the man who'd been humiliated, cuffed, and thrown into a cell, was now the chief witness in a federal investigation that would shake the department to its core. But justice, I knew, wasn't finished yet, because somewhere deep inside, beneath the relief, there was a slow-burning question, one I couldn't silence. What if there hadn't been cameras? What if no one had recorded? No clerk had noticed? No FBI agent had answered the call? The thought lingered long after the lights came up. That's when I made a promise to myself, and to every nameless face who'd never gotten that second chance. This wouldn't end with my release. It would begin with it. By the time the sun rose over the city, my name was already everywhere. News tickers ran wild. Federal judge wrongfully arrested by local cops. FBI confirms evidence tampering at 7th Street Precinct. Justice turned victim. I sat in the back of the Bureau's transport van, hands free, but heart still heavy. Freedom after humiliation doesn't feel like victory. It feels like survival. Outside, reporters swarmed like bees around a flame. Microphones flashed, questions collided mid-air. "Judge Davis, do you plan to press charges?" "Sir, what do you have to say to the officers who framed you?" "Are you going to resign?" I didn't answer any of them. I simply said, "Justice doesn't stop at the courthouse door." That one line would replay on every news station by noon. At the FBI field office, agents worked non-stop. Dozens of files spread across tables. Photos, fingerprints, emails. A trail of deceit too messy to hide anymore. Special Agent Keller stood by a whiteboard covered in arrows and timelines. Evans falsified at least 7 reports. Johnson approved them. Navarro, she paused, was their lookout. But he's talking now. He says it's been going on for years. I sat quietly, watching the evidence stack higher than my anger. When Keller finished, she turned to me. Sir, we'll be recommending full federal prosecution under Title 18, civil rights violations, perjury, unlawful detainment. But the press wants a statement from you. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. I'll give one, but not to the cameras. Not yet. By evening, I stood outside the courthouse steps, the same steps where I'd sworn to uphold justice 100 times before. Now, they felt different, heavier. A sea of people had gathered, activists, lawyers, journalists, and ordinary citizens holding signs that read, "No judge is above the law, but no law is above justice. Accountability has no badge." The courthouse doors opened, and U.S. Marshals escorted Evans, Johnson, and 2 other officers into custody. Their faces were blank, but I could see it, that flicker of disbelief that their world had finally caught up to them. Navarro walked separately, head bowed, hands cuffed, but eyes red from tears. For a second, our gazes met. He mouthed, "I'm sorry." I nodded once. "Tell the truth," I whispered back. The trial that followed wasn't mine, but I attended every hearing. I watched the same system that once ignored me, now trying to correct itself. The prosecution played the gas station footage, the dash cam clips, and the fabricated report. Evans's voice cracked when he realized his body cam had recorded everything, including the moment he dropped the bag beside my car. The courtroom was silent, except for the hum of the air. Vents. Johnson tried to claim ignorance. Navarro confessed everything. And I, sitting in the gallery, not on the bench, saw justice unfold in slow motion. When the verdict came, it was almost poetic. Guilty on all counts. Evans was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Johnson received 8. Navarro, due to cooperation, got 2 and a chance to start again. But punishment alone doesn't rebuild trust. It only clears the ground. 2 weeks later, I returned to the same gas station. The place looked smaller now, quieter. The clerk, an old man named Omar, recognized me instantly. "Judge! They talk about you on TV every day," he said, smiling. I looked around. The pumps gleamed in the morning sun, the air thick with gasoline and memories. "That night," I said softly, "you saw everything. You didn't look away." He nodded. "Some people can't afford to." That hit deep. I bought a cup of coffee, stood near the same spot where the cuffs had snapped shut, and realized, sometimes, justice isn't a grand moment in court. It's just an ordinary man refusing to look away. Back in my chambers, I stared at the empty gavel on my desk. The Chief Justice had offered me a leave of absence, time to recover, reflect, maybe even write, but I didn't want to disappear. So I signed the papers that created a new initiative, the Davis Civil Integrity Foundation, an organization dedicated to defending citizens who'd been falsely charged or unlawfully arrested. It wouldn't erase what happened, but it would make sure someone else didn't have to live it. Later that night, I went home to a quiet house. The air still smelled faintly of coffee and rain. I stood by the window, city lights blinking like slow heartbeats below. For the first time since that night, I let myself feel everything, the anger, the fear, the gratitude. And then I smiled, because justice, finally, had remembered my name. The courthouse had never felt so heavy. Each step up those marble stairs echoed with ghosts of judgment, power, and everything I'd once believed was unshakable. It had been 40 days since the verdict against the officers. The media had moved on to newer scandals, newer villains, but the scars they left on this city, and on me, hadn't faded. Now, For the first time since that night, I was returning to the bench. The Chief Justice had called it a symbolic reinstatement. I called it something else, a reckoning. As I entered courtroom 3B, every eye followed. Some saw a hero, some saw a victim, but I didn't care what they saw. I knew what I had become. Not broken, not bitter, just awake. The clerk read the docket. Case number 2845, State versus Leon Briggs, unlawful possession, resisting arrest. The young man standing before me couldn't have been older than 23. His wrists bore faint red lines from cuffs that had been too tight. His eyes were tired, not from guilt, but from fear. His attorney, a public defender barely out of law school, glanced nervously at the prosecutor. The evidence? A single bag of powder, found in the suspect's jacket during a street stop. The officer's report looked eerily familiar. Same phrasing, same justification, same hollow story I'd heard 100 times. My hands tightened around the edge of the bench. I looked directly at the officer on the stand. Officer Daniel Price, I began. You claim the suspect reached for his waistband when you approached? Yes, Your Honor. And you recovered the evidence after that? Yes. Where's your body cam footage? The man hesitated. It malfunctioned. A murmur spread through the courtroom. I leaned forward, eyes locked on him. You expect this court to believe that your body cam conveniently failed during the most critical moment of an arrest? He swallowed hard. It happens sometimes. Yes, I said softly. It does. Sometimes. The silence that followed was electric. Then I turned to the prosecutor. Dismiss this case. Your Honor, we still have— Dismiss it. The words left my mouth steady, but my pulse thundered. For the first time, the system that had swallowed me was now answering to me. After the hearing, the young man, Leon, approached me outside. Sir, he said quietly, thank you. I didn't think anyone would believe me. I looked at him and saw a reflection of myself in that cell. Helpless, angry, but alive. You don't need anyone to believe you, I said. You just need truth to speak loud enough. He nodded, eyes wet, before walking away. That night, I met with Agent Keller again. The FBI investigation had uncovered something bigger, a network of falsified reports spanning multiple precincts. Evans and Johnson were just part of a chain. They were paid off, she said, flipping through files. Evidence swaps, ghost arrests, even civil forfeitures being redirected. It's a machine. And your case cracked it open. I stared at the papers, not in shock, but in understanding. Corruption never dies, I said. It just changes uniforms, Keller smiled faintly. Then we'll keep changing locks. Over the next few weeks, something shifted in the city. Departments across the county started auditing old cases. Judges began demanding more transparency. And for the first time in years, people started believing the word justice again. The Davis Civil Integrity Foundation grew overnight. Donations poured in from professors, activists, even retired cops who wanted to make things right. We launched our first program, Free Legal Defense for Victims of False Arrest. The waiting list filled within hours, but I wasn't doing it for reputation. I was doing it because I finally understood the cost of silence. One evening, as I was leaving the courthouse, I found a letter slipped under my car windshield. No signature, no address, just a few words written in shaky pen. You reminded us that the law is only as honest as the people who carry it. For a long moment, I stood there, reading those words again and again. The city lights glowed off the hood of my car, and the hum of traffic sounded almost like applause. Maybe I'd never erase what happened that night at the gas station, but maybe, just maybe, I'd turned it into something greater than pain. The next morning, I stood once again before a courtroom full of strangers, ready to begin another trial. This time, though, I didn't see defendants and prosecutors. I saw stories, each one waiting for someone to listen without bias, to weigh truth without fear. I adjusted my robe, struck the gavel once, and spoke softly. Court is now in session, and this time, justice will stay awake. The night before my retirement, the courthouse was almost empty. The halls that once echoed with arguments and verdicts now breathed quiet, like a theater after the final act. I walked those marble corridors slower than usual, my fingers brushing along the cold railing. It had been 2 years since that day at the gas station. 2 years since asphalt met my cheek and steel kissed my wrists. And 2 years since the law I served turned around and served me back. They called me the judge who stood up to the system. I called myself the man who simply refused to kneel twice. In my office, I sat behind the same mahogany desk that had carried decades of truth and lies alike. On one side sat my gavel, worn smooth by thousands of decisions. On the other, a framed photo of the courtroom the day reforms were signed into law. The Davis Accountability Act had passed 6 months earlier. Body cams mandatory, every arrest cross-reviewed by civilian boards, and any malfunction had to be logged and justified before a judge. For once, the ink on the law actually meant something. That night, I opened the last letter I'd been avoiding, an invitation from the police academy to speak at their graduation. At first, I laughed. Then I read the small handwritten note at the bottom. We want our new recruits to hear what justice sounds like from someone who survived its silence. And so I went. The next morning, sunlight poured through the academy windows, glinting off rows of polished badges. Young officers stood in perfect formation, uniforms crisp, hearts proud, unaware of how heavy those emblems could become. When they called my name, I stepped up to the podium. I didn't speak from notes. I spoke from the place where memory and purpose meet. 2 years ago, I was handcuffed for the crime of existing in the wrong story, I began. And when I looked up from that pavement, I realized justice doesn't collapse because of bad laws. It collapses because good people stay quiet. The room went silent. You'll be given power, I said. But power without humility is just arrogance in uniform. Your badge is not permission. It's a reminder. Every time you touch those cuffs, ask yourself if you're protecting someone or punishing them for making you uncomfortable. No applause, just quiet, the kind of quiet that means people are thinking. After the ceremony, a young cadet, couldn't have been more than 21, approached me. His voice shook as he said, Sir, my dad was at that gas station that night. He recorded everything. He said he didn't mean to get involved, but he couldn't look away. I stared at him for a long moment, feeling something warm settle in my chest. Your father changed more lives than he'll ever know, I said. He smiled. He says the same about you. That evening, I drove to the Synaco on Route 47, the same station. Pump 3 still standing there under the humming canopy lights. It looked smaller now, quieter, but the air still carried the memory. I stood by the pump, watching cars pull in and out. Families, workers, travelers, all moving through their lives, unaware that this little stretch of asphalt once held the weight of a nation's conversation. A familiar voice called out. It was Omar, the station owner. He'd aged a little, more gray in his beard, but the same calm in his eyes. He grinned. You still remember this place, Judge? I smiled. Hard to forget the world's most expensive tank of gas. We both laughed. He handed me a cup of coffee. Same brand he'd given the officers that night before the chaos began. But this time, it tasted different. It tasted like closure. Before leaving, I looked up at the station camera, the one that had captured everything. It blinked its little red light like a heartbeat. Funny, I whispered. You might have been the most honest witness I ever had. Then I turned to Omar. Keep those cameras running. He nodded. Always, Judge. Months later, after I retired, I started teaching part-time at the law school. My students expected lectures on precedent and policy. What they got instead were stories. Stories about human moments, the hesitation in a rookie's eyes, the tremor in a defendant's hands, the silence that hangs in a courtroom when truth finally breathes. I told them, the law isn't a weapon, it's a mirror, and what you see in it depends on who you are when you're holding it. Some of them wrote those words down, others just listened, and that was enough. Now, when I walk through the city, people still recognize me sometimes. Some nod respectfully, some whisper. A few approach and say, "You made me believe the system could work again." I always answer the same way. Don't believe in the system. Believe in the people who force it to be honest. Late one evening, I sat by my window, a copy of the Constitution open beside my tea. The Fourth Amendment still felt different under my fingertips. Not as text, but as testimony, and as the city lights shimmered outside, I thought about those who never got the chance to tell their story, whose names never trended, whose truth stayed buried in unfiled reports. That's when I made my last note in the margin of my journal. The same notebook I carried that night I was arrested. Justice isn't about how loudly the innocent scream. It's about how quickly the world decides to listen. I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and let the quiet hold me. Somewhere out there, a gas pump hummed, a camera blinked, and justice, for once, stayed awake.